Hello, and welcome to Philibron's Computer Networking Lab. You're watching the instructional video called Secure Shell. We are looking at an office building with 3 floors, and there is a router on each floor. The network administrator is on the first floor, but he wants to access the router on the 3rd floor. He can go up to the 3rd floor and connect his console cable to the router, but realize that it would be easier for him to connect the console cable to the router on the 1st floor and use the Secure Shell protocol to remotely access the router on the 3rd floor. Remote access is a wonderful way to monitor or configure a router that is far away or difficult to access. We could use Telnet, but the problem is that Telnet sends all its information in clear text. If a hacker was to sniff the network, he would be able to learn the passwords to the routers and the switches. Instead, he decides to use a secure shell to access the remote routers. These are the steps that we're going to use to configure the secure shell. First, we're going to change the host name and the domain name. The reason why we want to do this is because when we generate the public keys and the private keys, the generator will be using that information to create a unique set of encryption keys. This will make it much more difficult for a hacker to be able to break the encryption. Next, we're going to want to set up a username and password for anybody who's going to access the router. Also, we're going to protect the privilege mode with the password. And lastly, we want to configure the VTY line so that it will accept terminal input from the secure shell. Let's look at the commands needed to access a router using the secure shell protocol. In order to start the session with the remote router, you will type in the SSH command into the router on the 1st floor. The public and private encryption keys must be generated using the crypto key command. To enable the username password combination on VTY lines, the AAA new model command is needed. One method for accessing the router using the SSH command is to configure the username password command on it. To access the privilege mode using the SSH command, the enable secret command must be configured on it. To accept terminal input only from the secure shell on the VTY lines, the transport input SSH command must be configured. We are looking at the terminal window of the router on the 1st floor. Let's try to access the router on the 3rd floor using the secure shell command. As you can see, it will not allow us to connect. Now, let's view the terminal window of the router on the 3rd floor using a very long console cable. We have to change the default host name and domain name in order to generate the public and private encryption keys. The username and password has to be set or the router will not let us connect to it. The password to access the privilege mode has to be set. We will tell the router to only accept input from the secure shell. Now, let's go back to the router on the 1st floor and try to log in again. We are able to log in into the router, and we are able to access the privilege mode in the router on the 3rd floor through the router on the 1st floor. But then the network administrator realized that there is a more simpler way to access the router on the 3rd floor. He is able to create a secure shell from his desktop computer in his office to the router using a secure shell terminal program. The computer is not directly connected to any of the routers, but rather to a switch through an Ethernet cord. Let's take a look at what he sees. First, we will use a secure shell to connect to the router on the 3rd floor, and then we will put in the password to start a session, and another password to enter into the privilege mode. As you can see, the command prompt shows that we are in the router on the 3rd floor. We just saw a great way to access remote routers without having to travel to their location. And best of all, we do not have to worry about hackers sniffing our network. I hope this video has been informative, and I thank you for viewing.